I did not realize how fragile my life had become until I saw strangers questioning my sanity and family members deciding my future without asking me. The betrayal did not come with shouting or violence. It came quietly, disguised as concern, wrapped in words like safety and responsibility. One day, I was managing my own life. The next, I was being managed. What hurt most was not the fear of losing control, but the realization that the people I trusted were willing to erase my voice to ease their own. That was the moment everything inside me cracked, and then hardened. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how these stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with emotion, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a story you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Lewis. I am 72 years old, widowed, and I live alone in Scottsdale, Arizona. I have learned that people tend to pause when they hear those details, as if they are silently filling in blanks for me. Lonely, forgetful, fragile. I let them think what they want. I know who I am, and I know the life I built long before anyone decided my age defined my limits. I chose Scottsdale because of the quiet. The dry air eases my joints, and the mornings arrive slowly, without noise or urgency. My apartment is not large, but it is orderly, and everything inside it exists for a reason. The couch faces the window to catch the light in the afternoon. My documents are filed by year and category. My calendar hangs where I can see it every morning, not because I forget, but because I like structure. Order has always been my way of staying grounded in the world. Before I retired, I spent more than 3 decades as a senior accounting manager for a regional construction firm. Numbers were my language. Precision was my responsibility. If something was off by even a small margin, it mattered. That career shaped me in ways that never faded. I trust patterns, I notice changes, and I don't make decisions lightly. That part of me did not disappear when my hair turned gray. My days now are slower, but they are full in their own way. I wake early, make coffee, read the news, and review my finances once a week, just as I always have. I enjoy the predictability. It gives me peace. Living alone does not frighten me. It never has. Solitude is not the same as isolation, and I learned that distinction years ago. My son, Ethan, does not see it that way. He is 45 now, confident, practical, and increasingly convinced that he knows what is best for me. My daughter-in-law, Brooke, is polite in the way that feels rehearsed, always careful with her tone, always framing concern as kindness. Together, they have a habit of speaking to me as if I am standing on the edge of something dangerous, even when I am firmly planted on solid ground. They still have a spare key to my apartment. I gave it to them years ago, after my husband passed, back when emergencies felt like a reasonable possibility instead of a vague excuse. At the time, it seemed practical. Family looks out for family. I had no reason to question it then. Looking back, I realized the shift did not happen all at once. It arrived quietly, hidden in small comments and suggestions. Ethan would ask if I was sure I paid a bill, even after I told him I had. Brooke would mention safety features I had not asked about. They spoke as if my independence were temporary, something to be managed rather than respected. I noticed the discomfort but dismissed it. I told myself they meant well. After all, they were my family. I did not want to be the kind of woman who imagined insults where none were intended. I chose patience. I chose silence. What I did not know then was that those small moments were not isolated. They were the foundation of something much larger, something already taking shape beyond my awareness. At the time, I still believed that my home was mine, that my life belonged to me, and that trust, once given, would not be used as leverage. I was wrong about that. If you're still watching and starting to sense that something feels quietly wrong beneath the surface, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. What happens next is where small doubts begin turning into real warning signs. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. The first sign that something was off did not arrive dramatically. It came quietly, disguised as a routine notification on my phone. I was reviewing my monthly expenses, the same way I had done for years, when I noticed my electric bill was lower than expected. Not by much, but enough to catch my attention. I checked the usage history, then the settings. Someone had adjusted the energy preferences. I had not done that. At first, I assumed it was a system update or an automatic adjustment. I made a note in my planner and moved on. Old habits die hard. When something does not make sense, I document it before reacting. Still, the feeling lingered. A faint pressure behind my ribs, the kind that comes when numbers no longer line up the way they should. 2 days later, I received an email from my bank thanking me for my recent inquiry regarding my retirement account. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, reading the message again to be sure I had not misunderstood it. I had not called my bank. I had not requested information. I logged into my account, reviewed the activity log, and found a record of a phone inquiry made earlier that week. The call was not from my number. I did not panic. Panic clouds judgment. Instead, I cross-checked my records, verified my balances, and confirmed that no transactions had been made. Everything was intact. Still, the question remained: who had asked about my account, and why? The next email arrived the following morning. This one unsettled me more than the rest. It was a confirmation for a home safety evaluation, scheduled for later that month, specifically designed for older adults living alone. The language was polite, almost cheerful, but the implication was clear. Someone had decided I needed to be assessed. I had never requested such a service. I deleted the email, then restored it, then read it again. Patterns matter. 1 anomaly can be dismissed. 3 cannot. That afternoon, I called Ethan. I kept my tone neutral and asked if he knew anything about the bank inquiry or the evaluation email. He paused, just long enough for me to notice. He said he thought I had mentioned needing help and suggested that I might have forgotten. Brooke joined the conversation shortly after, her voice smooth and reassuring. She said they were only trying to be proactive and that I should not take it personally. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply told them I had not asked for any of it. The conversation ended without resolution, wrapped in vague assurances and carefully chosen words. When the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at my planner. The notes I had made over the past week formed a line I could no longer ignore. I began to see the shape of it then, the questions about my memory, the suggestions framed as concern, the quiet decisions made without my consent. None of it had happened in isolation. It was a process, slow and deliberate, unfolding just out of reach of a confrontation. What troubled me most was not the actions themselves, but the assumption behind them. Someone had decided I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. Someone had decided that my independence was negotiable. I felt a tightening in my chest, not from fear, but from a growing sense of vigilance. That evening, I reviewed my files and changed a few passwords, quietly and without announcement. I did not accuse anyone. I did not explain myself. I simply paid closer attention. Experience had taught me that the most important shifts often happen before anyone realizes a conflict has begun. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I understood something with unsettling clarity. Things were already moving without my permission, and whatever came next would not be accidental. If you're still here and noticing how concern can slowly cross into control, comment number 2 to let me know you're following closely. The next chapter reveals a discovery that changes everything. Let's move on to chapter 3. The morning I found the document felt ordinary in every visible way. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, the air was still, and my coffee had gone untouched on the counter while I sorted through emails. Nothing announced what was coming. That, more than anything, unsettled me later. There had been no warning, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet message waiting to be opened. The subject line was neutral, almost polite, something about future planning documentation. I assumed it was another automated notice and nearly deleted it without reading. Habit stopped me. I opened the attachment and felt the calm of the room shift, as if the air itself had tightened. It was a financial power of attorney, not a blank form, not a suggestion, but a completed draft. My full legal name was typed neatly at the top. My address was correct. My date of birth was correct. Beneath it, in the section labeled Appointed Agent, was Ethan's name. Everything was filled in, carefully and deliberately, except one space. My signature line was empty. I read the document slowly, the way I had read contracts for most of my adult life. The language was precise: authority over my financial decisions, access to my accounts, the ability to act on my behalf if I were deemed unable to do so myself. There were clauses about incapacity, about protection, about acting in my best interest. It was all very reasonable on the surface. That was what made it dangerous. No one had mentioned this to me. No one had asked if I wanted it prepared. There was no cover note explaining how it had come to exist. It was simply there, waiting, as if the next step were inevitable. I did not feel panic. What I felt was something colder and heavier, a realization settling into place. This was not concern. This was preparation. Someone had already decided that my ability to manage my own life was temporary, and they were positioning themselves accordingly. I called Ethan. I did not raise my voice or soften it. I asked him directly why a financial power of attorney had been drafted in my name. There was a pause, then an answer that came too easily. He said it was just in case, just being responsible. Brooke joined the call soon after, reinforcing the same idea with carefully chosen words about planning ahead and avoiding complications. I told them I had not agreed to any of it. I said I was not incapacitated, confused, or in need of management. Their responses did not address that. They spoke instead about responsibility, about burden, about what happens when families do not prepare. The conversation ended without apology, without acknowledgement that a line had been crossed. When I set the phone down, I sat very still. The document remained open on my screen, its empty signature line glaring in its restraint. It struck me then how far ahead they were thinking, how much had already been decided without my involvement. This had not been drafted overnight. It had taken time, discussion, and intent. Trust does not usually break all at once. It fractures quietly along stress lines you did not realize were there. In that moment, I understood that the relationship I thought I had with my son and daughter-in-law was no longer intact. They were no longer asking for my cooperation. They were preparing for my absence from decision-making. I closed the document without saving it. I did not reply to the email. I placed a note in my planner and began listing what needed to be reviewed: accounts, access, legal boundaries. I had spent my life understanding systems well enough to protect myself within them. That knowledge had not disappeared. As the day went on, a single thought returned again and again, steady and unmistakable. They were not waiting for permission. They were waiting for opportunity. And I would not be signing away my life quietly. If you're still watching and feeling the tension rise after that revelation, comment number 3 below, so I know you're still with me. What comes next is a confrontation that can't be undone. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. After I discovered the financial power of attorney, I did not react the way people expect when they imagine betrayal. I did not confront anyone immediately. I did not raise my voice or demand explanations. I waited. I needed to be certain of what I was dealing with, and certainty has always come to me through observation, not impulse. For several days, I paid attention to the atmosphere of my own home. The silence felt different, heavier somehow, as if the walls were holding something unsaid. Every time my phone buzzed, I wondered whether another decision had been made without me. That awareness followed me through my routines, quiet but persistent. By the end of the week, I knew that speaking face to face was unavoidable. I asked Ethan and Brooke to come over that Saturday afternoon. I was careful with my words, neutral and calm, giving them no hint of how resolved I already felt. They arrived on time, walking in with the familiarity of people who believed they still belonged there. Neither of them asked if it was a good moment. They never had. We sat at the dining table, the same one where my husband and I had once planned vacations and balanced budgets. I laid out my concerns plainly. I told them I had seen the legal document. I said I had not given consent for any financial planning on my behalf. I asked them to stop contacting my bank and to return the spare key they had been using to access my apartment. The response came quickly and predictably. Ethan minimized the situation, speaking as if I had misunderstood something simple. He framed it as foresight, as preparation that any responsible family would consider. Brooke followed, her tone smooth and reassuring, explaining that everything they had done was meant to protect me from future complications. The implication hovered unspoken, but unmistakable. They believed I was already slipping. What struck me was not what they said, but what they did not. There was no acknowledgement of my authority over my own life, no apology for acting without permission, no recognition that a boundary had been crossed. Instead, they spoke as if my discomfort were an inconvenience, an emotional reaction that would pass if handled correctly. I felt something settle inside me then, a quiet clarity. This was not a misunderstanding that could be resolved with explanation. It was a fundamental difference in how we viewed my role in my own existence. To them, I was a risk to be managed. To myself, I was still the person I had always been. I told them, calmly and without hesitation, that I would not be signing any legal documents. I said they did not have permission to manage my finances, access my accounts, or make arrangements on my behalf. I stated that my home was not open to them unless I explicitly invited them. I asked again for the spare key. The room grew tense. Ethan's expression hardened, and Brooke warned that refusing help could create serious problems later. The words were measured, but the message was clear. If I did not cooperate, they would find another way. When I repeated my request for the key, Ethan refused. He said it was necessary for safety and implied that taking it back would be irresponsible. That was the moment I understood the conversation was over. Dialogue requires mutual respect, and there was none left to work with. I did not argue further. I did not plead my case. I simply noted internally that the last reasonable path had closed. After they left, I remained at the table long after the door shut behind them. The apartment felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like contested ground. I knew, with absolute certainty, that the situation would escalate. They had made that clear. What I had hoped could be resolved through conversation had revealed itself to be something far more dangerous. And if I wanted to protect myself, words alone would no longer be enough. If you're still here and wondering how far the situation can escalate, comment number 4 to show you're staying with the story. The next chapter is where everything spills into the open. Let's continue with chapter 5. The shift from private tension to public scrutiny happened faster than I expected. It began with a call from the building management office, delivered in a tone that sounded polite but carried an edge of concern. They said they were checking in, making sure everything was all right. There had been a report, they explained, and they wanted to be proactive. The word lingered in the air long after the call ended. Until that moment, my apartment had been my refuge. Now it felt exposed. I walked through each room, noticing how familiar corners suddenly seemed vulnerable, as if the walls themselves were listening. I had done nothing wrong, yet the quiet certainty of that did not protect me from the discomfort settling into my chest. 2 days later, an email arrived from a local social services office. It referenced a referral regarding my well-being and proposed a brief assessment to ensure I was living safely and independently. The phrasing was gentle, almost considerate, but the implication was unmistakable. Someone had told them I was no longer capable of managing my own life. I read the message twice, then closed my laptop and sat in silence. There was no mystery about where it had come from. Evaluations do not appear out of nowhere. They require context, concern, and a narrative that makes intervention seem reasonable. I could picture it clearly: the careful wording, the emphasis on age, the suggestion of confusion. Brooke had always been good at sounding responsible while shifting control out of sight. The realization struck deeper than anger. It was humiliation, quiet and sharp. My competence, my reputation, the identity I had carried for decades, all reduced to a checklist of risks. This was not about safety anymore. This was about rewriting who I was in the eyes of others. I began to notice changes in how people interacted with me. A neighbor asked if I was feeling all right. Her smile tightened, searching. The concierge lingered longer than usual when I signed for a package, as if assessing me. No one said anything directly, but I could feel the subtle recalibration happening around me. Once doubt is introduced, it spreads quickly and politely. I thought back to the conversation at my dining table, to the calm certainty with which Ethan and Brooke had dismissed my objections. They had already moved beyond discussion. This was the next step, the escalation they warned me about without ever naming it. They had taken something intimate and turned it into a matter for institutions and procedures. That night, I stood in my living room with the lights off, looking out at the quiet street below. I had lived here long enough to recognize the sounds, the rhythms, the sense of belonging. And yet, for the first time, I did not feel secure. The apartment was the same, but my place within it had been compromised. I understood then that staying meant submitting. It meant allowing my choices to be questioned, my capabilities evaluated, my autonomy slowly eroded toggle for visibility. True. That night, after the emails and the calls and the quiet recalibration of how people looked at me, I sat alone in my apartment and let the noise settle. The rooms were the same ones I had moved through for years, yet they felt unfamiliar, as if ownership itself had become conditional. I did not pace or cry or spiral. I have never been wired that way. When pressure rises, my mind narrows, and the path forward becomes clearer. I understood that I was standing at a fork I could not ignore. One path meant staying where I was and continuing to explain myself. It meant answering questions that were never really questions, attending evaluations that were framed as care, and defending my competence in rooms where the conclusion had already been written. It meant living under the soft glow of supervision, where every decision could be second-guessed and documented. The other path meant leaving. It meant disruption and distance and silence. It meant accepting that people would panic when they realized they could no longer reach me. But it also meant something else, something far more important. It meant preserving the only thing that truly mattered to me now, the right to decide my own life without negotiation. I approached the choice the way I had approached every difficult decision in my career. I listed the variables: time, risk, control, consequence. Staying offered the illusion of stability but no real authority. Leaving carried uncertainty but restored agency. Once I saw it that way, the answer stopped feeling emotional. It became practical. I decided then that I would not argue again. I would not send messages or try to clarify intentions. Every explanation I offered would only provide more material to be reinterpreted against me. Silence, I realized, was not avoidance. It was containment. If they could not access my thoughts, my plans, or my whereabouts, they could not move ahead of me. The next morning, I contacted an attorney whose name I had kept filed for years, a precaution I had once hoped never to use. We spoke calmly and precisely. I explained the situation without embellishment. He listened, asked pointed questions, and confirmed what I already suspected. Preparation mattered. Documentation mattered. Boundaries needed to be established before they were tested further. Over the following days, I worked methodically. I secured copies of my financial records and medical documents. I reviewed access permissions and updated them quietly. I did not announce these changes. I did not need to. The strength of preparation lies in its invisibility. As I moved through my routines, I noticed a strange sense of calm taking hold. For weeks, I had been reacting to signals I could not fully interpret. Now, I was acting with intention. That shift changed everything. I slept better. I thought more clearly. Fear loses its power when it is replaced by planning. The decision to leave Scottsdale did not come with sadness. It came with relief. I did not need distance from the city itself. I needed distance from the narrative that had formed around me there. I began researching places that valued structure and discretion, places where privacy was enforced by policy rather than trust. I did not share these thoughts with anyone. Not Ethan, not Brooke, not neighbors or acquaintances. Information, I had learned, was leverage. One evening, as I stood at the window and watched the sun sink behind the buildings, the choice crystallized fully. I would leave before anyone else could decide for me. I would move on my own terms, at my own pace, and without warning. There would be no dramatic exit, no final confrontation to analyze and debate. By the time I turned away from the glass, the plan was already forming. And for the first time since all of this had begun, I felt steady again. If you're still watching and felt the weight of that decision, comment number 6 below to let me know you're still here. What happens next is the aftermath no one expected. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. I left Scottsdale without ceremony. There were no announcements, no explanations slipped to neighbors, no last looks meant to be remembered. I packed what mattered, organized what remained, and closed the door behind me with the same care I had always used in that apartment. When I walked away, it was with intention, not haste. Silence was part of the plan, and I kept it intact. The place I moved to was quieter, more deliberate by design. Entry required identification. Guests were logged. Keys were not passed around casually. I noticed the difference immediately, not because it felt restrictive, but because it felt respectful. My presence there was acknowledged without being questioned. That alone steadied me. I unpacked slowly, placing each item where it belonged, reclaiming a sense of order that had been disrupted for too long. I did not check my phone that first day. I did not need to. I knew what would happen once Ethan tried to use the spare key. I could picture the moment clearly, the hesitation, the second attempt, the irritation that followed. Control rarely announces its absence politely. It reveals itself through frustration. By the second day, the calls began. At first, they were measured, spaced apart, the kind meant to confirm details. When those went unanswered, the messages multiplied. I did not listen to them. I did not need their words to understand their shift. Concern quickly gives way to panic when access is denied. I learned later, through quiet channels, that Ethan had gone to the building office demanding information, that he had insisted something was wrong, that Brooke had reached out to acquaintances, asking if anyone had heard from me. Their narrative was familiar by now, framed in worry and responsibility, carefully omitting the part where my boundaries had been ignored. What they did not expect was the wall they encountered next. My bank had flagged the recent inquiries. Any attempt to access my accounts without authorization was documented and blocked. There would be no quiet workarounds, no helpful conversations with representatives who assumed good intentions. The systems I had put in place did exactly what they were meant to do. They held. From where I sat, in a space where no one could enter uninvited, the noise faded into something distant and manageable. The contrast was striking. While their world grew louder and more frantic, mine grew calmer. The imbalance spoke volumes. I had not said a word, yet the consequences were unmistakable. For the first time in months, I felt unobserved. No one was assessing my tone, my decisions, my competence. I could make tea without imagining how it might be interpreted. I could sit with my thoughts without preparing to defend them. The relief was not dramatic. It was subtle and profound, the kind that settles into the body rather than announcing itself. I understood then that their fear was not rooted in love alone. Love does not require surveillance. Love does not unravel when it cannot reach through locks and policies. What frightened them was the loss of leverage, the sudden absence of the influence they had come to rely on. I did not feel guilty about that realization. I felt clear. The distance had done what conversation could not. It had exposed the true nature of the dynamic by removing my participation from it. As evening fell, I stood at the window of my new place and watched the lights come on one by one. Somewhere else, phones were ringing unanswered, doors were not opening, and certainty was slipping through unfamiliar fingers. Here, there was quiet. Here, I could breathe. They were afraid because they could not reach me. And for the first time, that fear belonged entirely to them. For several days after I settled into my new place, I maintained the silence I had chosen. My phone continued to register missed calls and messages, but they no longer carried the same weight. Distance had changed their tone, even before I listened to a single word. Silence, I learned, becomes powerful once it is no longer fueled by fear. I did not intend to disappear forever. That had never been the point. Avoidance only prolongs uncertainty, and uncertainty invites intrusion. What I needed was clarity, delivered in a way that could not be twisted or reframed. Emotion had already been used against me. I was done offering it as leverage. Once I felt steady, I contacted my attorney again. The conversation was brief and focused. I explained that the time had come to define the limits of involvement clearly and formally. Family dynamics had already proven unreliable. Structure would have to replace them. The letter he drafted was precise and unambiguous. It stated that I was mentally competent and fully capable of managing my personal and financial affairs. It affirmed that no individual had authority to act on my behalf without my explicit written consent. It instructed that all unauthorized attempts to access my accounts or arrange evaluations were to cease immediately. It also made clear that any future violations would be documented and addressed through appropriate legal channels. There was no blame in the language, no accusations, just facts, boundaries written in ink instead of raised voices. When I reviewed it, I felt no anger, only a quiet sense of alignment. This was what protection looked like when it was done properly. The letter was sent without announcement. I did not follow it with a call or an explanation. The message did not require reinforcement. Its authority came from its clarity. The response, such as it was, arrived indirectly. The call slowed. Messages became shorter, more cautious. The urgency drained from them, replaced by restraint. They understood finally that this was no longer a conversation they could steer. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. What struck me most was how little satisfaction I felt. There was no sense of victory, no desire to press further. Control had never been my goal. Stability was. I had not acted to punish anyone, only to secure my own footing. The difference mattered. In the quiet that followed, I began to settle fully into my new routine. I learned the rhythm of the building, the flow of the neighborhood, the small comforts that made a place feel inhabited rather than temporary. Each day reinforced the same truth. Peace does not come from winning arguments. It comes from removing yourself from the need to have them. I reflected often on how easily things had escalated once assumptions replaced conversation, how quickly concern had transformed into entitlement. The experience had sharpened my understanding of where responsibility ends and control begins. Love, I realized, does not require access. It requires respect. By the end of the week, everything was in place. My accounts were secure. My boundaries were documented. My life was once again governed by my own decisions. The noise that had once followed me from room to room had faded into memory. This was not punishment. It was protection. And for the first time in a long while, that distinction felt not only necessary, but earned. If you're still with me and curious how all of this finally resolves, comment number 8, so I know you're ready. What comes next is the conclusion that brings everything into focus. Let's move on to the final chapters and the ending of this story. Time has a way of settling things once the noise stops. In the weeks after my attorney's letter was delivered, life grew quieter in a way that felt deliberate rather than tense. There were no sudden confrontations, no dramatic apologies, no last attempts to pull me back into explanations. The storm had passed, not because it burned itself out, but because it ran into boundaries it could not cross. I noticed the change first in what did not happen. No more unexpected calls from institutions asking to confirm my condition. No follow-up emails suggesting evaluations or check-ins. My bank statements arrived without alerts attached. The systems around me returned to neutrality, responding only to my actions, not to whispered concerns or secondhand narratives. Stability reasserted itself, and with it came a deep sense of relief. Ethan and Brooke adjusted, whether they wanted to or not. Their involvement narrowed to what I had allowed, and nothing more. There were no quiet attempts to gather information through other people, no indirect inquiries framed as worry. Whatever strategies they had once relied on no longer worked. The absence of movement spoke louder than any argument could have. They had reached the edge of their influence, and it held. For my part, I focused on living rather than reacting. I established a rhythm that suited me, one built on choice instead of defense. Mornings became something to enjoy again. I took walks, read without distraction, and handled my affairs without the background awareness of being monitored. Independence, once threatened, now felt reinforced by intention rather than habit. What surprised me most was how connected I felt, even as I stood firm in my autonomy. I did not retreat from people or shut myself away. I spoke with neighbors, joined activities, and allowed myself the simple pleasure of community without surrendering control. I was not isolated. I was selective. the difference mattered. I thought often about the nature of family and how easily roles can shift when fear enters the equation. Ethan would always be my son. Brooke would always be part of that connection. But the version of the relationship I once assumed was permanent had changed. It had to. Trust, once broken, does not return to its original shape. It reforms or does not exist at all. There was no bitterness in that realization, only acceptance. I did not need to punish anyone or demand understanding. My responsibility was not to manage their discomfort. It was to protect my own dignity. That clarity simplified everything. Occasionally, I wondered how things might have unfolded if I had stayed and continued to negotiate. The answer came easily. I would still be explaining myself, still defending choices that required no defense, still existing within a framework built by someone else's fear. Leaving had removed me from that cycle entirely. As weeks turned into months, the narrative around me faded. People move on quickly when there is no drama to sustain their interest. What remained was my life, intact and governed by my decisions. That outcome felt earned, not accidental. I had not lost my family, despite how it might have looked from the outside. What I lost was the illusion that love alone protects boundaries. What I gained was something far more valuable. I reclaimed my voice, my authority, and my right to exist without justification. Standing in my home one evening, listening to the quiet that no longer felt heavy, I understood the truth I had been circling for months. I did not disappear to make a point. I stepped away to survive with integrity. I did not lose my family. I reclaimed myself. Now, with time between me and everything that happened, I can see the shape of it more clearly. Distance does that. It strips away the urgency and leaves only what matters. What once felt overwhelming now feels instructive, like a lesson I had been avoiding for years because I believed experience alone would protect me. It did not. Awareness did. For a long time, I confused patience with peace. I thought that tolerating discomfort was the price of keeping family close, that silence was kinder than confrontation. Many people my age grow up believing that harmony is something we maintain by stepping back, by softening ourselves, by letting others take the lead when they insist they know better. We tell ourselves it is love. We tell ourselves it is temporary. Often it is neither. What I learned is that concern, when left unchecked, can turn into entitlement. The line between helping and controlling is crossed the moment someone decides your life needs managing without your consent. That line is rarely crossed all at once. It erodes slowly, disguised as practicality, framed as responsibility. By the time you recognize it, the ground beneath you already feels unstable. Boundaries are often misunderstood. People imagine them as walls, cold and defensive, designed to keep others out. I no longer see them that way. Boundaries are structure. They are the framework that allows relationships to exist without harm. When they are absent, even good intentions can cause damage. When they are present, respect has room to breathe. I also learned something about aging that society rarely admits out loud. Growing older does not erase judgment, competence, or self-awareness. It does not invalidate a lifetime of decision-making. Yet older women, in particular, are often treated as if autonomy has an expiration date. The moment we slow down, others begin to speak over us, then for us, then instead of us. That progression feels natural to those who benefit from it. It is anything but natural to those who live inside it. If there is one truth I hold firmly now, it is this. Independence does not mean isolation. Choosing yourself does not mean rejecting love. It means insisting that love arrive without conditions attached. It means understanding that your life, no matter your age, is not a committee decision. I think of those who might recognize themselves in parts of my story, the ones who feel watched instead of supported, the ones who sense their choices being quietly rewritten. If you are there now, I want you to know something important. You are not imagining it. Discomfort is often the first signal that a boundary has already been crossed. Listening to that signal early can save you from having to fight later. You do not need permission to protect your peace. You do not need to justify clarity. And you do not need to wait for things to become unbearable before you act. Strength does not always look loud. Sometimes it looks like calm preparation. Sometimes it looks like walking away without explanation. The hardest part of this experience was not leaving. It was accepting that love without respect is not love at all. It is possession, softened by familiar language and good intentions. Once I understood that, the rest followed naturally. My life now is quieter, but it is honest. Every decision I make belongs to me. Every relationship I maintain exists within mutual respect, not obligation. That balance did not come from winning an argument. It came from choosing myself when it mattered most. If there is a final lesson here, it is a simple one. Boundaries are not a rejection of others. They are an affirmation of yourself. And once you learn to protect that truth, no one gets to take it from you again. When a life returns to quiet after upheaval, what remains is not anger or victory, but clarity. Some experiences are not meant to harden us, but to refine us, stripping away assumptions we carried for too long. Independence is not about standing alone against the world, but about standing firmly within it, aware of where responsibility ends and selfhood begins. True peace is rarely loud. It arrives when choices are made with intention, when boundaries are drawn without cruelty, and when dignity is preserved without apology. Aging does not diminish the right to decide, to choose, or to protect one's inner balance. In many ways, it sharpens it. The courage to step back, to redefine what is acceptable, and to walk forward calmly is a strength often underestimated. If this story resonated with you, thank you for listening. Your perspective matters. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this speak to you, consider following and subscribing to support more reflections like these.